Hi everybody, good evening. Just about 5ish, we might have a few late lambs, but we'll start on time. You're very welcome. This is the third in our series of lectures from the SIG group. I see some familiar faces. Anyone here for the first time in the series? Oh, great. You're more than welcome. So we have had Dr. Helen Greeley did our first one on looking at different theories and models of grief, and John McAvoy was here last week talking about loss and grief in the intellectual disability sector. So delighted to have Ursula Bates with us this evening. Welcome, Ursula. Speaking on bereavement and mindfulness approaches, resources for the therapist. And I've heard Ursula speaking on this before, and I think it's very interesting to see how these two areas can be brought together. Ursula is Principal Clinical Psychologist and Head of Bereavement in Blackrock Hospice, which she tells me has about 300 deaths a year. So this is very relevant. Ursula has a particular area and expertise, let me say, in the area of mindfulness, and she's been teaching it since 2003. Delighted to have you here this evening, Ursula, and thank you.
Thanks very much, Susan. I thought I might just do a rough head count in how many of you are familiar with mindfulness? Like how many of you know it? Yeah, that's a big lot of you. Who's done formal training in it? Or who's done like the 8-week course? Or okay, so we've a subgroup that have done the formal training. Okay, because what I'm going to kind of assume is a certain kind of basic knowledge, right, of it. I'm going to kind of go back over the basics. But it's always a challenge when, as a psychologist, you try to put two things together, like bereavement and mindfulness. You have to kind of do a lot of thinking and reflecting about it, particularly as at the moment mindfulness is flavour of the month and we're trying to sprinkle it a little bit around the place, right? So you have to look at your own population, know your population very well, and then wonder about how to bring the two things together and begin that process of thinking and reflecting. Because I feel myself what's asked of us as psychologists is to bring that thinking bit with us about what are we doing and why are we doing what we're doing. So we have roughly 300 deaths a year, which means that when we're planning the service, we plan for 600 bereavements over the course of a year. So there's, in terms of people who may be impacted by the loss, that's a rough kind of figure we work from. And on the bereavement side, I have 1.5 social workers, both of whom are very well trained. I have myself, I have a chaplain, and I have usually 4 students on placement, 2 from the Masters in Psychotherapy and DCU, and 2 come from either the DPN or the counselling courses. So it's quite a mixed pot that we have. So year on year, we have a system of following up on people. They get a 6-week phone call from us to see how they are. They get 1 to 3 sessions of crisis intervention if they need it very rapidly after a loss, because we get quite a bit of post-traumatic stress presentations. Because while you might think dying in a hospice is a beautiful event, hospices now are really specialist palliative care units. So we're like a premature baby unit. We get all the very vulnerable, the very complex cases. So we get very traumatic losses, quite sadly, within our unit, from which the nurses need to be debriefed, and we run debriefing groups for them. But also, we would have loved ones who witnessed quite traumatic deaths, and we take them back for pretty much what would be straightforward post-traumatic stress debriefing. So they come back in very rapidly for that. So this is a population which initially, as we meet them, we would not be doing mindfulness with them. Unless they had previously had mindfulness or meditation experience, you wouldn't start at that point, because psychologically they're quite overwhelmed and they have a lot of material coming through their minds that they can't easily digest, right? So initially we have in our relation to them to be the container for them, to help them process that initial area of loss. It's only further along. So what we do then is to send them back out again for after that initial period of time, and in roughly 6 months' time they all come back from memorial service, which is a very useful ritualized community-based event. And when you're dealing with bereavement, rituals are extremely important containers. So very important wherever you're working to involve your chaplaincy or have a very close liaison with them. And we're always very encouraging of people doing any kind of ritualized grieving, whether that means going to graves or whatever it is. And you wouldn't get unusually worried. People do very unusual things in bereavement. It's probably, I always think psychologically, it's the closest to going mad. when you're bereaved. You have all kinds of internal experiences that don't sit easily within a rational framework. But I think you have to be extremely tolerant of what does that mean to the person. I have one lady who lost her 5-year-old son, and she goes to the graveyard and she combs the grass on the grave. And she combs the grass on the grave because she still needs to do the mothering she was doing with this lovely young child. So for her, the meaning of it is taking care of him. You know, so you always have to kind of go into the construction and the meaning of it. What is the person trying to express in what they're doing in their actions? So we have a memorial service which is very, very containing. About 100 people come to it. We run it 4 times a year, and it's very religious rather than psychological, although it's not attached to any particular denomination. So we have lots of poems, lots of music, and we invite in different ministers from different religions to do that. And it's only then at the 9-month point that we actively write out and say to people, do you think you're in need of a counselling intervention? And if so, would you mind getting in touch with us? We allow them to contact us back. And we get roughly between 10 and 20% of our population to come back for counselling at that point in time. So about 2 years ago, the Irish Hospice Foundation gave us a very large grant to look at mindfulness and bereavement in using groups. And we sent out 450 letters at that point in time to the next of kins of 2 years of our service, roughly, because some of we didn't have names or some of them weren't enough. And roughly 50 people said, yes, I need to come back, which is roughly 10% of our population. Now, that was very helpful for us because I'm sure Susan's going to be doing work on prolonged grief next week, aren't you, right? So there's a big issue always with bereavement in terms of what's normal and what's prolonged grief. So for us, the good thing about that was seeing that our own population themselves were very able to identify what they needed themselves. Because it is a worry, you know, what we're giving and what do they need.
Don't just reach it.
I think it'll be okay. It'll ease up soon.
You sure?
Yeah. So that's roughly the population that we serve, and then we took back, and so we ran 5 mindfulness-based bereavement groups last year. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the data from those groups. I will stop cooking in a minute. So I brought you 2 papers. So I'm going to hand this one out first because I'm going to have a little look at this one. I have an analytic training as well, so this paper comes from that background. Great, thanks. Now, so when the population I'm primarily talking about then are a population that come back in for counselling, or the population that came back with whom we did the 8-week bereavement, mindfulness-based bereavement course. So this is a population who are 9 months into their grief and are stuck in some way. So we're not talking about people who have followed a normal course in grief. This group have gone down a cul-de-sac of some sort, and therefore they need quite a robust kind of intervention. I'm very fond of Joseph Campbell. Don't know if you know his work, The Hero's Journey. A very useful book if you want to have a read of something that is very mythological. And Joseph Campbell is very strong on the notion that we must be willing to let go of the life that we have planned, so to have the life that is waiting for us. So for people who 9 months down the road are experiencing quite significant psychological problems with their grief, we approach them very much from this point of view, that really we're going to be asking people to let go of the life that they had planned for themselves, which a bereavement has taken from them, so that they can have a life that is waiting for them. Now, this is a particular kind of position. One of the things as a therapist or a psychologist is somewhere in your professional life, you need to begin to look at your own philosophy of life. Where are you going to stand on certain kinds of things? I mean, we meet people who are shattered by loss, absolutely shattered in themselves. And if I can't hold some faith or some hope for them that there is a point beyond their shattering, it's very hard for them to hold it either. So there's a bit of a philosophical position tied up in this work as well. And it is to have that trust that there is a life waiting for them. And what's, I think, lovely about the kind of service I'm in is that people do come back to us 5 years later and tell us how their lives are 5 years afterwards. So partly my faith in doing the work is based on what people come back and tell us much later on. So anybody who's coming in for bereavement work, one of the obvious things to remember is they've already been bereaved. All of us, whether you've lost somebody or not, you have already, by virtue of being alive, been bereaved. And we get bereaved in very different kinds of ways, because life forces you onwards. You have a continuous series of losses. First, you have to give up satisfactions in order to reach new positions. So developmentally, you've got to give up sitting on your butt in order to walk. So you have to give up the pleasure that you got sitting on your butt, or being breastfed, or having nappies. What a nice pleasure to have a nappy. And you have to go through that profound change, which requires you to give up the satisfaction of not having to control your bowels, control your feeding, control your oral desires, and become socialized. So all of us already know an awful lot about these shifts. And the person who's really, really good on it is Milton Erickson. Milton Erickson wrote a lot of his hypnotherapy material based on watching his sister. He was paralyzed when he was 14, and he lay on a couch for 2 years, and he watched his sister develop. And he talks beautifully about how do you shift from sitting to standing? How do you face that struggle and the challenges of moving from one position to another? So already when you're working with people, you're working about something that they know about in themselves, unconsciously and kind of biologically. So biologically, we're pushed through changes as well, right? So life forces us through change, or socially, you can be pushed through a change. Often when I'm working with people, one of the things I ask them about is, what was it like to go from primary school to secondary school? That's something a lot of people know an awful lot about, because that's quite a significant developmental change that's kind of forced on you. So, you get to a certain age and somebody says to you, you're going to secondary school. What was that like for you? Was that a pleasant experience? Was that something you desired? Did you go because your friends were going? Were you ready for it? Was it a shattering disappointment? Do you remember standing in your new uniform in the bike shed and wanting to go back across the road to the national school? So what is that like at a subjective level for you? That tells you a lot about certain kinds of changes in your life. And clients are very, very helpful at saying things like, they'll tell you the internal story of what that was like for them. Or they may say to you, oh no, it wasn't primary school, they'll say. It was that awful move from secondary school to college that nearly killed you. And so you find then, where do people get caught on change and what happens to them around it? You can be seduced to change. You can fall in love, which is an interesting way of changing. And it can be disastrously disappointing. And you can feel that you were kind of lost your freedom in it. So there are certain kinds of seductions that occur in your life as well that can change you and can leave lingering unpleasantness. Or we can be forced to change. And most people who come for bereavement work to us feel that they have been forced by life to change. This is not something they signed up for. They didn't sign up for this one. And we because of our catchment area, we're in an area where we have lots of CEOs, lots of very eminent gentlemen who fully expect of their wives to live long lives and not to die first. And they get extremely upset and annoyed. This was not how they had planned it. And often it's the first experience they have of a traumatic life event which they have no control over, and money doesn't make any difference. Money can't change in any way. So they can be very bruised within themselves around that kind of experience. So loss is the absence of something that we were attached to. I'm missing that there. Grief is the rope burns left behind when that which is held is pulled beyond our grasp. That's from Stephen Levine, and he talks very much about that it's something that we were deeply attached to, and it's just being pulled from our grasp. So one of the little articles I've given you out is Heinz Wolff's one. It's very helpful because it looks very much at all of these kind of changes that we're impelled through in life. I'm very fond of Jerome Keegan, who is the chap down here, who looks at the different stages of the self and the different levels you need to go through to move, because he sees life as a spiral of development. What should I do? and marker, Susan. So Keegan is a lovely, lovely writer, and he sees life as this ongoing, expanding spiral. So that very much you start down in the impulsive stage, and you move out into a more imperial stage where you know your needs and your wishes and what you want and what you don't want. And he sees us being very defined by the no, by a capacity to say, when you're age 2, you know, that we often define ourselves by negation first. I won't wear my wellies, I won't wear my t-shirt, I won't do this, I won't do that. So we tighten ourselves up against it. And you have some clients who come in that state. But then we move out into latency, where we join into the school and the rules. So out here, we're much more rule-bound, we're in latency, we want to do things the right way, we want to join in the gang. And then we move on at the age of 15 into an interpersonal world. We move further on then into the world of institutions. So he sees us moving out here into the world of peers, the age of 15. By 18 to 25, you're looking for an identity within an institution or a career, and then finally you're moving out into your inter-individual world. Now, why am I telling you this? I'm telling you this because Keegan has a very strong notion of the environment of embeddedness in which we make these moves. So Keegan says every shift we make, which is on one hand a loss and on one hand a gain, every one of those shifts is made within a particular kind of environment. So the first shift is made within the dyad of the mother-child, right up to the age of 2. And at 2, we begin to take more notice of the fathering, who is the father. By 7 to 15, we're very much moving from the world of rules into the world of peers. So if you've somebody bereaved at the age of 15, their concern is going to be much more about the world of their friends and their peers. We had a young girl die at this age 15, and she very much died on Facebook, which was a very new phenomenon for us. 250 children in South Dublin fallen from death on Facebook, which left lots of questions for us about the containment of that and how that was managed. But it's a very new world for us. So one of the most significant questions looking at a bereaved person is, what is the container within which their bereavement is being processed? So where are they able to share, talk and process that loss? And this is where we're going to link into mindfulness as well. So what is the containment, the container within which it's all happening? Because that, I think, is one of the things that makes a difference between whether a loss follows a normal course or whether a loss becomes very difficult for somebody. If the container within which it's being processed is adequate, I think they do okay. If it's not, I think they have great difficulties. So you're looking at who is the person talking to, who are they relating to. And sometimes people come for counselling not because there's something majorly pathological about their loss, but because they know the container in which to manage it. So they come in for a service. So that containment is very important. And I don't know how many of you have worked with bereavement, but if you think about the bereaved people you've worked with, compare them to maybe other cases you've had. I don't know if anything strikes you that might be different about dealing with bereavement and loss as distinct from dealing with a normal psychotherapy case. Does anything kind of come to mind? Do a bit of a comparison.
I suppose change is permanent if somebody's gone.
Change is permanent and it's very externalized. That's one of the difficulties when you're dealing with it therapeutically, is that it's a very concrete object outside of themselves. So they have their eye on the loss, and you spend a lot of time therapeutically trying to get them to get their eye back on themselves. So they will talk at great length and in great detail about the loss, and you have to make a determination. Why do they need to talk so much about the loss? Because it might be that there's something traumatic in it they haven't processed, right? So you have to think, how long do I keep letting them tell this story? Eventually it becomes quite repetitive, but then try and draw them back onto who are they in the loss? What is their experience of what's happening? Yeah. The other problem is that the level of affect is very high. When you're dealing with people who have very serious losses, their level of sadness, grief, anger, rage are very, very high levels of affect, which they then get very frightened of. They get afraid of themselves. So this is another reason you're looking for a good, strong container. Okay, I mean, just briefly to say this, because I'm sure somebody has covered it, the model we use now nearly all the time is the dual processing model. Are you going to talk a bit about that, Susan? Maybe yes, maybe no. Helen would have talked about it as well. In other words, when you're looking for models of bereavement, Woden is pretty useful. WORDEN, very, very standard model, but pretty useful. But Chuck's model, what is Chuck's model?
Strawberry and Chester.
Yeah, sure. Did. This one is very useful because it allows people to oscillate. So at various points in time, people need to work on their loss, work quite intensely on it, and work in very focused ways on it. So they need to, if possible, to keep a grief diary, set aside some time at night in which to work on their grief maybe. So they need to allow for the intrusion of grief, and they need to really struggle with this notion of what am I going to do about this attachment and this bond? How am I going to be able to let it go, replace it, all of that. They need to look at their denial, what are they denying, what are they avoiding. So they need to work on that track, but equally they need to restore their lives. And there's a broad gender difference on this, in that, broadly speaking, women are better at doing this work. Women are better at the actual emotional grieving process and worse at the restoration process, right? So it's very common. We still have women who have never handled money and never signed a check. We still see women in that state who have to begin that process of picking up that restoration side. And generally we find the men are quite good at that, but they have great difficulty with emotional processing. So every time we run a group, we try to make sure that there's always at least 2 men in every group so that the men can work together. So we get the men to do men tasks and girls to do girl tasks to try and manage this imbalance that happens. It's quite a significant imbalance. Now my population are quite old. You know, I mean, the vast majority of my population are 50 plus. So these gender balances may not hold for a younger population. But this is a very, very useful model because it is what it says on the tin. You can hand it to people on a sheet. It's very understandable to people. It has good face validity, so they can struggle with it and understand it. So we're asking a lot of people. We're asking them to move towards very painful affect that they're probably avoiding, and we're asking them to make this huge adjustment on the other side into change, and asking them to tolerate moving over and back on this track all the time. So we need to support them developing a steady enough pot. So initially your container is going to be in your work between yourself. You as a therapist working with them is going to be the container. But then you want them to begin to hold that container inside themselves. And to be honest with you, I think that's where mindfulness has a value, is in strengthening their internal container in the face of managing all of this work. Now, these we did the grief cognitions questionnaire, which is a very useful questionnaire, with the population that we had that came in for group work. Because again, if you're looking at your client population, grief is very idiosyncratic. It's a very unique individual journey for most people, for how they position themselves in relation to a loss. So when we were going to do the groups, we were going to run the 8-week mindfulness-based cognitive therapy course for grief. We wanted to try and understand a little bit better what were the cognitive therapy components we could put into the groups. So we gave them the grief cognitions questionnaire, and we had a very good comparison with an American sample that Bolin had done. And what we found, now this is a particular South Dublin sample with a very high levels of education, all in, well employed or retired on good pensions, no economic factors involved in this group at all, and again a well-educated group. And the most significant factor for them was threatening interpretations of their own grief. So it was very much an internal psychological factor, which was they were panicked by their own psychological reactions to their own grief. That was factor number one. And the next factor was a very strong belief about cherishing the grief. So as we interviewed the people for group, a lot of them saying to us, now what am I going to be asked to do in group? Because it's very important for me that I honour my relationship with the person that I've lost, and my grief is a way of honouring that relationship, right? So they were cherishing the grief. So they were very unwilling to let it go. So we had a lot of interesting initial interventions around that. So the first intervention we did with them was to ask them to look at the advantages and disadvantages of being bereaved, and which is a very cold-blooded cognitive therapy question to ask people who are very, very bereaved, right? But we were very concerned that if they went forward in the intervention without clarifying that for themselves, they were going to have great trouble engaging with the intervention. So very, very important never to make an assumption that somebody wants to get over a loss. They don't necessarily. So if you're working with them, they tie your hands because they come in for counselling, but at the same time have a secret position on it, which is to continue to honour the death of the loved one. Right? So it's a very tricky position to struggle with. So we had great fun asking them all the advantages and disadvantages of being bereaved. Very fun groups, and they finally got their heads around it a little bit. The next one up was worries about themselves. They were worries about how they were in the world, and they were very, very unlike the American sample in that they weren't worried about the future at all. They hadn't lost their trust in life. They weren't unduly worried about other people or other people's reactions. This group felt supported by others. They felt that the world was a safe place to be in, and they weren't unduly worried about the future. So they were quite an interesting group, right? All their worries were about their own reactions themselves, and about themselves interpersonally, and about cherishing the loss. So does that make sense, or does it surprise you in any way? Or we wouldn't get this now if we did a group in Ballyfermot. You mightn't get the same response, right? So I think I'm kind of saying to you, really, to say to you, always look at your own population. Always look at them. Yeah, don't make assumptions about them. You know. Okay. Great. So that's how we designed then the cognitive therapy side of it. So, what's mindfulness going to do for you? First and foremost, we hope it's going to help you process the grief in whatever way it manifests, and ideally, you want to process it in such a way that it's not going to keep rumbling around, affecting people well below the level of their awareness. Now, this is where you find people acting out in bereavement. We would find quite a number of people who go on trips, become very active, find new partners, and basically are trying to go across the emotional level and not processing it very well. So we're hoping with mindfulness to help them do that. We're hoping them to have a kind investigation into their acceptance of the powerlessness, their own powerlessness, right? That ultimately can offer hope, because it begins to unearth the heart that has room for it all. So as you help them build an internal container, what you're hoping to do with mindfulness is expand their emotional capacity to tolerate their own affect. And you want them to use the resources of their heart, because there's always issues around forgiveness, there's always issues around courage, their own courage in the face of what's happening, and their own trust. And these are much more heartfelt concerns than cognitive concerns. So, you're starting really the first 4 sessions that we run. So, you're looking at 2.5 hours per session. So, by the end of that first 4 sessions, they have 10 hours of mindfulness under their belt. And the whole purpose of those first 4 sessions is to build their capacity to focus mindfully in order to tolerate the affect that's arising inside. That's really the primary focus of those first 4 sessions. Whether they're doing the body scan or whether they're doing the breathing or whatever they're doing, it's to tolerate that. Now, we asked, this group were all 9 months plus bereaved, and at the end we asked them, if we had put this intervention in earlier, would it have helped? And they all said no. And they said that their minds weren't able to be still earlier on in the grief process. It took to 6 to 9 months before their minds could still themselves adequately. Now, that's again something to be experimented with. You know, I think if you had an individual client that you've been using mindfulness with, who then became bereaved, I think maybe then they'd have enough practice under their belt or enough capacity to carry them through it. But I think it's very difficult to start teaching people mindfulness in the height of what really is a very emotional personal crisis. Now I don't have a hard and fast rule on this, but it's just something to be cautious about. I'd be cautious. And if I did it in individual therapy, like if I had somebody come in and do a little bit of steady breathing at the beginning of the session, I'd be very careful to check back in an inquiry to see what was that experience like for them before I'd jump too easily to go forward in any way. You know, because if they told me that they were too agitated to still their mind or they couldn't follow the instructions, I'd let it go. Let it go at that point. There isn't much research on using mindfulness individually with people. Not a huge amount. So we just have to be a little bit careful. Nearly all the research comes out of the group-based interventions. So we just have to be a little bit careful of that. Is there anything you want to ask me about that, or any thoughts about it? No? Okay. Thoughts you want?
Will you invite them back after the 9-month visits to run a group, or are you using it individually then?
I put them all into group this year, but we would see some people individually, yeah, and we would vary a little bit. One of the social workers is trained in mindfulness as well, and she's quite dedicated to using it individually with people, whereas I'm a little bit more boundaried in my mind in the sense that I'm trying to think if somebody comes back individually, I'd more have a psychotherapy focus on them, and then I would be more inclined to put them out to do mindfulness, maybe to go down to Ostrich and do a mindfulness course. But that's me. I'm just a little bit more careful purely because I value the time enormously in the sessions, and I want I have very clear reasons as to how I want to use the time. But I would occasionally start a session by getting somebody to sit and breathe and think a little bit about it, just use it a little bit. But that's just me. Mark Epstein, Thoughts Without a Thinker. You've read it? Very good book on boundary between psychotherapy and mindfulness. And he's very clear that there are people who do meditation who badly need to be in psychotherapy, and there are people in psychotherapy who badly need to do mindfulness. So he's very clear about trying to make those kinds of discriminations. He's very good therapeutically on that. Now, so one of the things I wanted to kind of get across to you today a little bit about was about being in fallow places, in the sense of being in empty spaces, being in in-between spaces, being in liminal spaces. This is what mindfulness is really, really good for, being neither one place nor another, trying to stay in the in-between, because bereavement it's very concrete, it's very emotional, it's often a very dramatic kind of presentation. And both within myself and within the client, I'm trying to get them to not bounce off these empty spaces. Because people talk an awful lot about loneliness, despair, emptiness, not knowing where to go, all of those in-between spaces. And they, of course, are impelled in themselves to try and move away from those kinds of spaces, right? So very, very important that my practice enables me to sit in a fallow space and wait for something to emerge, not move too fast on something. And I was trying to think of an example of this. I had a lady in today who's 57. She lost her dad 4 years ago, and she lost her father at the same time. She was made redundant out of her job. She lost her dad. One of her sisters had a crisis in her marriage, and she had a row with her mother-in-law with whom she lived. So a number of things came together in this woman's life. This lady has been to our mindfulness group. She's well able to practice. She knows how to do her breathing and all of that. But she arrived in today. She now has 12 sessions of individual therapy following being in the mindfulness group. Right? So she's back in therapy with me now. And she arrived in today, and she talked initially in the session about the fact that she'd gone for her disability, some disability, and she had a review for disability. So the beginning of the session was all about how the doctor doing the review for her disability, she's out on a ticket of depression following the death of her father. The doctor who was reviewing her disability wasn't listening properly to her. So I'm thinking, okay, so I'm hearing that she'd not been listened to adequately by a professional, so I filed that one away. And I'm sitting breathing, and then I heard all about her son who has now chucked his college course and is a grave disappointment to her, and he's now driving her mad, and he's doing nothing. So I thought, okay, so not alone is the doctor useless, the son is useless. And then the husband, whom she'd been having dinner with the night before, had been so unable to listen to her that she had walked out of the room and locked herself in her bedroom. So I'm thinking now the husband is disappointing, right? And she goes on a little further, and I was getting really irritated with this woman, and absolutely pissed off with her, right? So I'm saying, Ursula, calm down. Use your analytic bit, so I go backwards rather than go forwards. Try and sit, try and breathe, try and think, what is coming towards me? What is coming down the track towards me? So that's where my mindfulness supports me pausing. So I asked her, I said to her, would you mind, can we just pause together for a moment? Can we just sit together? Can we just see what's happening here? What's happening here? And so I gives me time to think in my brain, what am I picking up? And I said to her, it sounds like there's a lot of disappointing things happening in your life, right? So I'm thinking, smile faces, nothing growing, nothing happening. I'm thinking, Ursula, go sit now, and don't budge off this one. So we talked for 20 minutes on and off in a very roundabout way about life's disappointments, how wildly disappointing life is, right? And we talked about all kinds of disappointments. And she then talked much more deeply. In fact, she dropped a level and she said, I've been hearing my father's voice, and she's very, very devoted to her dad, who's dead now 4 years. And she hears her father's voice calling her. And I said to her, what might that be about? Why now? But why now? Why might your dad's voice be appearing now? And she told me that after her son was born, she had had postpartum depression, and it had gone on for 3 or 4 weeks, and her father eventually had come to be with her, and he had said to her, now you're a Duffy, and us Duffies get over these things, and we get on with our lives. And so she began to cry, and she talked very beautifully about missing his voice in her life. She's missing that voice that said to her, we're the kind of people that get on with these things. And that was all that was said in the session. But to me now, that's a fairly good example of where you slow down, you go into a space yourself of not knowing and sitting and listening as deeply as you can, hand it back to the client. So one of the things at this stage, when in my practice at any point, both when I'm trying to meditate and when I'm trying to do therapy, I'm trying to not know. I'm trying to kind of go sit in the mud, not know, not ask for anything to happen, wait and listen, right? And start collecting those words for in between places, for despair, hopelessness, and feeling your way along it. Because I think if it's something makes a difference to this woman today, it would be sitting in disappointment so that she can let herself experience it and digest it, and just sitting with it and seeing what comes from it. Because I think she must have been a great disappointment to herself when she was depressed after her son was born, and I think there must be echoes of that coming through in some way. Right? But so when you're practicing your mindfulness, it's very important not to look for altered states of any sort. Like when I'm teaching people or I'm getting feedback from clients, never be seduced by altered states. So watch for people who tell you that things are too peaceful when they're doing their mindfulness, or that they feel better afterwards. And true mindfulness is simply awareness. It's the capacity to be aware in the moment. So it's not about realization, it's not about resting, not about any of those states, right? So you've got to watch all the time. Where are we? And finding images. I love images myself. I have to say I'm more visual than auditory. And finding images for these in-between kind of places is very important. Right. So we're getting somewhere? We're looking for a container. We're looking for a strong enough container. We're looking for a container both in the therapist and in the space with yourself and the client, and then you're trying to support the client developing some sort of a steady internal container to allow them experience emotions that they may be avoiding experiencing in their lives. And those emotions are more likely to be on the dark side. And on the shameful side. So it's always helpful to look at emotions that are kind of shame-inducing. Okay. So, containers. Scaffolding is one of the words I often use a lot with people, that, let's sit together and build a scaffolding. And it's often interesting getting people to practice. Talking to people, before you take down the building, you build the scaffolding. So that's why you do your first 10 hours of teaching and practicing before you begin to move towards the difficult. So in whatever way you're using mindfulness, the person has to have a modicum of a stable practice before you can move towards the difficult successfully. So in an ideal world, if they can sustain sitting, if they can sit for 15 minutes, but the problem is it's a little bit the quality of their sitting. So you need to find out how steady they're in their sitting. But if they can sit well for 5 minutes, they're doing great. If they can sit steadily for 15 minutes, it's fantastic. Then you've got the scaffolding within which they can begin to explore some difficult kind of states. If they can't manage that, you're back to having to provide that containment relationally between yourself and the client, right? And given that mindfulness is primarily a teaching done in groups, you have to make a decision, is that person in the right place? So should they be? That's why I was saying to you about my little fiddly thing about, am I doing therapy or am I doing mindfulness? You have to work that out. Because when I'm doing therapy, the containment is between myself and the client. And I have to be aware of how I'm managing that. Whereas in a large group, particularly if you have 15 in a group, the containment is in the mindfulness, not between you and the person. So they have to develop a steady practice. So practice is really important for them. So what are we hoping for? One is that they can observe the loss, and the other thing is that they can observe themselves. So as they build this internal container, you're looking at, usually when somebody is bereaved, they're enmeshed in the bereavement. So you've got this kind of a state where they're immersed in it in some way. And when they're not caught up in the bereavement, they feel like they're a fragment of themselves. So it's as if the person who died has taken away aspects of their psyche. So initially you get them to practice in order to contain, to provide a container for that space. Then as they move along, you're hoping that that container gets steadier. So basically they become more whole in themselves, and that little pot is inside them. So they become kind of steadier inside themselves in some way. And when that steadiness develops, that they can view the loss from a different position, but also that they can view themselves from a different position. So you get the beginnings of that, what's called the metacognitive shift, which is another place to stand. Helping them find another place to stand. I'm going to tell you quite a funny story about this. So we were in about session 6 in the groups, and in session 6 we required of everyone to get onto an edge of risk, to find an edge that would begin to push their loss and their bereavement. And we had one lovely, dignified South Dublin lady who said that at this stage it was her guilt that was consuming her. And we asked her if she'd be comfortable telling us a little bit about her guilt in the group. And her guilt was around the fact that she had lost her temper over the last course of the year of her husband's life. She had lost her temper with him quite badly. And she's a very dignified lady now. So, and it was quite a varied group. So we all took this with a pinch of salt. We all said, yeah, that's right. Grand, if you want to work on it, that's a very nice, appropriate thing to work on. Maybe you'd go away and think about how you'd like to work on it. So she came back to the next session and she'd read all his diaries. And in his diaries, he had written notes every time she lost her temper. So of course she came back in a much worse state, because she realised not alone had she been concerned about her losing her temper, he had documented every time. So he'd written, Mary loses temper again, uses foul language. So she came back in a much worse state. But the interesting thing, of course, psychologically, was she was moving right onto the edge of what was difficult for her. So the group listened, and groups are great for this. And the groups began to kind of banter over and back a little bit, and they said to her, what did you do when you lost your temper? So she told them, and they all thought this was quite amusing, because she had said to them, oh, fuck off. Oh, that's highly amusing. So they said to her, well, you're discovering the East Enders bit of yourself. And we used to set the homework communally, kind of, everybody had to always send the homework for people. So the homework she got was that she had to buy star paper, she had to go to her local class, she had to drink tea, she had to spend an hour in the local cafe drinking tea and reading the star, right? And that was her homework. So she came back to next school absolutely thrilled with herself. She brought the Star newspaper, she told everybody about it, and they then proceeded to teach her. For her next level of homework was they taught her a whole load of different curses, and they sent her off to practice cursing for the next week, right? Now by the time she arrived back, this was 3 weeks later, she came back and her guilt had lifted considerably, right? And she began to talk a little bit about that shadow side of herself that she wasn't willing to acknowledge, her rage or her anger or her frustration, all of those sort of things, right? But that was the biggest significant change for her was moving towards what was uniquely difficult for her, and then, thanks be to God for cognitive therapy, it has its place, and then doing an appropriate exercise that, of course, allowed the group to engage with her in a very robust kind of way. And that loosened that poisonous guilt that she had within herself. And we've seen them all since. 9 months later, she has a new partner, which we all were terribly sort of celebratory around and all of that. So, I mean, she's a good example of somebody who moved quite dramatically through a very significant loss. And the biggest problem for her, in terms of why she had got so stuck in her grief, she was not a first wife, she was a second wife. And she had been severely disenfranchised around the time of the funeral. She had been sitting at the back of the church rather than the front of the church. And there had been very problematic issues about her place in the loss at that point in time. So those kind of problematic things do happen. So she's a very good example of somebody who was able to move from observing the loss to observing herself. That profound shift towards taking her own grief very, very seriously and her own guilt very seriously, and beginning to say, what was that guilt about her herself, about a slightly overly perfect, tight understanding of herself. And it's where groups are very useful as well in loosening all those things, you know. So this is Greenspan, whose article I brought with as well. When grief shattered my heart after Aaron's death, that brought with it an expansion, the beginning of my experience of a self larger than my broken ego. So you're really working at helping people get into a bigger space. So I thought we should do a little mindfulness while we're here, but I want you to do it in very small steps. Don't want you to think about a big loss in your life, but I want you to think about a little loss. And initially, I want to think about the notion of intention, which is very much used in some parts of mindfulness and not in other parts of mindfulness. John Kabat-Zinn doesn't labour it a lot. But if we think of intention in a very simple way, if I was to ask you right now, how much of you is in the room at the moment? So if you have a think, are you 100% here? Are you 50% here? Are you 20% here? Now, it's not about right or wrong, but I just want you to pay attention to yourself. So how much of you is actually here at the moment? And be very kind to yourself about it. It's okay to be however you are, right? And I'd be curious then if you have a little compassionate think about what would it be like to choose to be here. So say you were to run a sentence across your mind which said, I choose to be here right now, and feel your way along that. So if there's only 20% of you here, and you then begin to think, I choose to be here, just feel the push and pull of that. Just feel what it's like for yourself, that push and that pull and that struggle, right? Because when you're bereaved, you end up in a space you don't really choose to be in, and yet to work usefully with mindfulness, you have to begin to move into that choice. I'm trying to choose to be here. So just, it's not about right or get a little bit of feedback on that? Who's 80% here? Okay. So 80% here.
Yeah.
So what was it like then when the airline were choosing to be computer here?
I didn't want to. There's a little thought that kind of fit in my head, but I didn't want to leave them behind it, and I kind of like going there a little bit.
You were going to have to lose something.
Yeah.
To make a little bit
Yeah,
of a
I
shift.
didn't want to just move forward here. I didn't want something else.
Yeah, because it is quite a radical thing to ask, isn't it? To actually choose to be 100% in a particular place. What a radical thing to ask. And so we have to be careful sometimes what we're asking people therapeutically. Without even articulating it, what we're assuming people are capable of. Anybody about 50-50? Half outside, half inside? Yeah. So it's like 50-50.
It's kind of like I have all the time. I think just never fully engaged. A bit of a dreamer, I would suppose. That's the way I interpret what you're saying.
Yeah. So this year.
Once I'm the outside, referred through my head, yes, everywhere I've done that.
So does it feel like a pressure then to be, when you think to yourself, I choose to be here? Do that feel slightly pressurizing, or is it like to kind of shift in that direction?
No, because I couldn't let go of the logical reaction that I did choose to be here because I came here at 5 o'clock, which was quite a difficult time to be here. And so the logic took over rather than the pressure. So
Right.
If you see that.
I disagree. Now, if you think I'm asking you radically existentially to turn up at this point in time, all of you, would you see your way around it? Like if I was saying to you, see, because when you are asked to sit in mindfulness, John's rule is, are you going to be on your cushion tomorrow, and how much of you is going to be on your cushion, right? So can you play with the edges of that? I'm not going to ask you about it, but play with the edges of what's it like to gather yourself in and make that kind of radical commitment. Because this is what mindfulness is good at, the fineness of these kind of shifts, right, in ourselves. And it's not about right or wrong. It doesn't matter if you only turn up for a second and then you dissipate again. That doesn't matter. It's about the knowing about yourself that you discover in those shifts. So the rest of your 80%? 80% here? Bit much? 70, yeah. So what was it like then to try and kind of choose to be here?
I thought 70 was enough.
Interesting client, right? So you were like, hey, listen, hang on, girl, the 70% of the year is pretty good.
Well, it was more that, the other 30% I didn't want to let go of, and then it got they were important.
Very, very interesting. So when you're practicing, the rule of thumb is you use your breath as an object, or you use an object as an object. I mean, in other words, you don't have to practice with your eyes closed, you don't always have to focus on your breath, but you've got to choose something. And the purpose of choosing something consistently is purely that it supports your practice, right? And it's not the falling off that matters, it's the coming back. It's that conscious connection to come back. That's what matters all the time. Now, so what's your intention? You need to think about your best intention with regard to your grief, despair, and fear and despair that's in your life. So often this is what we would ask of the patients. What can be your best intention today with regard to the grief, fear, and despair that might be in your life? Or, and this is in one of the articles that I have here for you, what would I want to learn or gain from this suffering? Now that's a very, very different question, because that's not a mindfulness question. It's a therapeutic question you can ask yourself. But it's not a mindfulness question. Whereas the first one is, what is my best intention with regard to my grief and despair in my life?
What do you mean by intention? What do you mean by intention?
What am I going to do with this?
Intention is related to the focus of your mind, and it's related to the notion that what we consciously choose directs quite dramatically the rest of our being. So that's how but it's more like an orientation, a turning compass. It's more like what we orientate ourselves towards. we're chasing desires at different levels all over the place. So often we don't gather ourselves in, right? And I think a lot of time is wasted in therapy because people don't consciously choose their intention of being in therapy. You know, they don't choose to be there, particularly in therapies where people don't pay. Do you know, in public services, where there isn't that notion of radically being there to do the work. And I think we need to really support people taking that on. So I often ask that question. So you're here today, what's your intention? What do you hope to get out of the session? So, without touching too much into your own losses, but it would be very useful for you to have a think inside yourself. So if you've had a loss within your life, what right now in yourself is your best intention with regard to that grief or despair in your life? Very interesting question. You know, and it's one worth struggling around. I'm not going to ask you to respond to it out loud, but you see, it asks you to position yourself in relation to something with a lot of emotional freedom around it as well, that we have the freedom to position ourselves in relation to these losses. Now, you may not experience that freedom in the moment. Like a lot of my cases would feel overwhelmed by the loss, so they'd fight that notion that there's some freedom in it. But in a bigger philosophical picture, you need to believe people are radically free in some way. Now, we can all argue about philosophy, but you need to really struggle with that notion within yourself, that people can recover, that they are free to take a position. So, at the beginnings, I'm going to be asking somebody to weigh the advantages and disadvantages of engaging in some form of bereavement counselling, but also I'm going to be also asking them what is their intention with regard to this. So how can they position themselves around it? Now, so one little exercise we're going to do is looking at this as well, very simple kind of exercise. So if you take a moment and get yourself comfortable on your chair. And take a moment, just will you check your body on the chair? So check that your body is stably seated on the chair. These are very large chairs. So take a moment just to see, are your feet on the ground? Okay, and stably seated. Always in the beginning, I like to come to the points of contact. So taking a moment to notice where your feet are. So dropping your awareness down, noticing the texture of your socks, the feeling of your shoes, and coming up along your body, noticing that gentle pressure of the chair beneath your thighs and up along your back. And then coming to your breath. Just becoming aware of that gentle movement of the air in and out of your body. And as best you can, following it in a very sensory kind of way, noticing what the air is touching on the way in. How your chest wall rises on the in-breath and falls back on the out-breath. And just checking in on your mind, just noticing where your mind is at. And just noticing in a very kindly, compassionate way, with that gentle notion that whatever is, whatever is. Letting your thoughts drift by, and just bringing the focus back to that gentle movement of your breath in and out of your body. Just breathing. Taking a moment just to very briefly scan your body. Just taking a moment to notice any holding in any part of your body. It's been a long day, and just noticing how your head is, or behind your eyes. How your shoulders are. Holding it very gently in your awareness. Allowing whatever is just to be. And just coming down your body through the core of your body. Across your pelvis, down your legs, and just breathing. We've been talking now together for quite a while about loss. And just if there's been anything arising within you yourself, it might be just some change or loss in your own life, just taking a moment just to notice where that is in your body, not going into it too deeply in your mind or your heart, but just noticing where that might be in your body. And just directing your breath around it. So if it's held in your heart or in your stomach, just as you breathe, breathing around the edges of it. Just cradling it and holding it in your breath. Just breathing. just doing whatever is right for you in this moment. Not going too deeply, just breathing. And if the feelings and sensations become too intense, just opening your eyes or coming back to using the breath as a focus. Just going to the edge, just coming backwards. And then taking a moment, if it's comfortable in your heart, just to unite yourself with all the people in the world who might be experiencing a similar change or a similar loss in their own lives. So it's just allowing your mind and your heart just to move outwards. Thinking of the community of people in the world that you're part of. And as you breathe, just breathing towards them. Being present to yourself and being present to them. And then gently, in your own time, bringing your focus back to your breath again. Just gently following your breath in and out of your body. Allowing yourself to come back to just the breath. Bringing your mind back again to the points of contact. Noticing your back, supported by the chair. Noticing that gentle support beneath your thighs. Noticing your feet on the floor. Then in your own time, you can come back to being in the room together. Okay. Give yourself a little stretch. Just to ease out your back. Now, a lot of mindfulness is in the inquiry, because in many ways while the exercises can be followed, the teaching is in the inquiry. And the inquiry is very simple. It's asking people, how was that for you? How was that for you in your mind? How was that for you in your heart? the reason for this is that the philosophy behind mindfulness is very clear, that to be human is a gift, to be in this life is a gift, to have a body therefore is a privilege, and that body sensations are simply body sensations. So what we do a lot of the time is we tighten physically around our pain. So very important, paying attention all the time to how the body is tightening and where it's tightening. And then what does it need to help it ease and loosen? Because if you can have pure body sensations and feelings simply arise, and simply are feelings, they'll find their own space, and that thoughts, with care and investigation and curiosity, we can manage our thinking, right? So the skill in doing inquiry is to have people get better and better at allowing body states to be body states, allowing feelings come in waves and find their own place, and not attach any story to the feelings, and then allow us to work with our minds. So, if I was to ask you, how was that for you? So take a moment and feel your way back through the exercise and see, can you feel any points of shift in your body? So was your body tighter in certain places, and then did it loosen out? So a few words on the knot from there. So what was happening in your body?
I jumped. I got to remind myself of my own joke because it's again.
Twitch.
Yes.
Yeah, the twitch tells you something about the tension in your body, and then begins to kind of release, right? Now, can you notice, does any point help with release? Like, is it just the breathing?
I don't know. It always takes a while to get in. I think it probably is the breathing because I'm making myself slow down. So I have to concentrate to slow down.
Yeah. Because any of us that have gone through a Western education have speedy minds. So we actually have to make a choice, and it's work to make that choice to begin to let your mind go. And do you have any sense, after the jolt, can you feel a softness in any part of your body? Can you notice if your body's softened?
Yeah, when shoulder.
So begin to imagine that softening. Any other body stuff going on?
Yeah, I noticed a struggle. The exercise brought me into the sense of tiredness in my body, and I noticed the resistance towards the tiredness. So there's a kind of secondary struggle going on, rather than the body just being the body. There's a secondary struggle going on.
And have you any sense of the history of that resistance? Is it literally locked into your muscles, or is there something going on in your head at the same time?
It's more just like a kind of, I prefer if it wasn't this way right now.
So a slight aversion, slight not loving it, not wanting it to be that way. So you begin to pull even slightly.
Yeah, and again I noticed that up my shoulders, in my head, I feel the tightness, the resistance.
And have you any sense where the edge of that is for you at the moment? Where's the, when you think of mindfully working with it, where's your edge around it?
The edge is around the acceptance.
This is what is.
This is what body is. And something about your invitation to use the breath with that is helpful. If that helped with the softening.
Not to the edge of it. Not to the edge of it. Okay. Any thoughts about now? This is one of the ones we use with people who are bereaved, because it's a tricky thing to ask somebody think about a loss and just go to the edge of it. That's always when you're working with the difficult. You're not asking people to go into it. You're asking them just to go tip around the edge of it. Any feelings or thoughts about that?
When I was tired, I was able not to get into it too far because I was too tired to go any further. So it was easier for me to not get into it.
So was it helpful problem to have somebody go to the edge of something and then come back off the edge of it. That's quite a skillful stage. I was trying to think, in that week 5, it's all about going to the edge of the difficult. It's very different psychotherapy now, very, very different. You know the way, if you're working psychologically with somebody, we have a tendency to want to get to the depths of it. So we have a tendency to go down into something. Whereas this is very different. You go to the edges first, and you stabilize the capacity to go to the edge before you go anywhere else, before you go in any further.
It was for me very easy to feel it in my body because I was very relaxed, and when you actually invite us to think about something, the topic came up and I can feel my body straight away.
Tensing up around it?
Exactly. Yeah.
We're very protective of our pain, and so we automatically tense around it, which is why grief people have lots of viruses and aches and pains and all kinds of things come with serious losses, because your body is in tense all the time. So Stephen Levine's work, which is very mindfulness based, is all about finding the place where you're holding your pain in your body, whether that's in your heart or your stomach or your head. And he has a lovely exercise about touching the place of pain. So he has people press on that place where they're holding their pain and do their meditation practice while holding that place. And he talks about it being the tender space of grief in our hearts. And it's a very deep exercise to do with people, so they want to be able to go further along to do it with them, because they hold it so much in their bodies. Now, how did you find the last little bit of it, which is about thinking about all those in the world that might be sharing that space with you?
That brought me out very much outside of myself, and it changed the proportionality of it. I really felt, oh, come on, what are you going to be complaining about?
It's a very definite shift in focus, isn't it?
Yes.
Very definite shift in focus. So it brings you in a different direction, rather than bringing you inwards into your own pain. It suddenly brings you outwards. See, the tricky thing about this now, it can be a positive or a negative. Do you know what I mean? It can go either which way.
Conscious of that.
Yeah. For yourself?
It's to do with my back is broken, and I'm saying, well, other people have a broken back. They don't just have the pain; they actually have the neurological dysfunction. And I felt I would be ashamed of my pain if I were in the presence of others who actually couldn't walk. So
there's a double edge on this one. There's a double edge on this one. Yeah. It is. This is the problem when with exercises. It can go one way, it can go another way, and that deserves care. Do you know what I mean? I think I was working with you now, being very interesting that it's brought up an edge that needs tender care to work with that, right? Any other thoughts?
For me, it was too soon.
Too soon. Yeah. A bit compressed. Yeah, a bit too soon. Yeah. So you felt it slightly jolted you.
Yeah.
It pulled you. Yeah. It's a problem when you take an exercise out of context. Yeah. Any other thoughts, Rich? Okay, it's an interesting exercise. We use it around the universality of suffering. That life is suffering, and that loss is a form of universal suffering, because it is a genuine, universal, developmental phenomenon. And most of the people we're working with have very specifically lost a spouse, which is not an uncommon loss to have, right? So it's about helping people expand their position around their loss as well, and bring a bigger dimension to it. But you have to be careful how you use it and when you use it. But it's a very commonly used exercise. Probably more towards the end of the groups we use it. Okay. Right. So, how we've time, Susan? Okay, we'll zoom through this and then have a bit of a chat. So obviously, if we're looking at what are the core components of a mindfulness intervention with bereavement. One is working with people's intention, getting people into the space. Obviously, all the obvious things, sitting, breathing, being mindful of emotions as body sensations and experiencing them as fully as possible. Now, it takes 4 to 5 weeks before you can get people into that space where they can experience as fully as possible what affect is arising. And in their minds, in their hearts and emotions, and in their body. So it's about trying to experience as fully as possible whatever is coming up. Very, very important to have a strand of compassion or affirmation, which is about cultivating mercy in oneself, developing a positive attitude towards dark emotions, supporting people around how they actually feel in their bodies, because people can feel a huge array of different body things. Supporting people using images. Obviously, mindfulness uses a lot of poetry, which is very helpful. People also have positive and negative images that need work with, and looking at the narrative that the mind is spinning around these emotions. So a lot of mindfulness, you're asking people to decouple the narrative of the loss from the affect that they're experiencing. So, say for example, with my client today, I was looking at trying to help her hold and experience the affect of disappointment without it looking too rapidly back into, I miss my father, I miss my father, if my father was here I wouldn't feel disappointed. Just trying to decouple that state for her. So it's very interesting developing compassion towards the emotional state that comes up. Beginning to work with those difficult kind of states is very important as well. So by this stage, we're looking at people trying to give up the story of their loss, because often the people we're working with who are 9 months along into the loss have developed a very repetitive narrative that they go over and over in their minds about the story of the loss. So we want them to begin to let that story go, one young man who was in the groups had lost his mother, and he was very preoccupied with the story of her loss. So what he got to do as homework was to write out in considerable detail the story of the loss. So he wrote it out for himself, and what he reported back was that he was only able to let it go when he knew it was written down, because he knew then he'd never forget it. So part of what he'd been trying to do in his mind by going over and over it was out of loyalty to her, basically saying, I will never forget how you have died. And he was going over and over it in his mind. And he had been using a lot of avoidance. He was a hill walker, and he'd be going for long walks at the weekends across the hills, which at one level sounds healthy. Do you know what I mean? That's what he'd been doing. But actually, as he was working in the group, he began to realise it was a way of avoiding his affect around her loss, because he would walk till he got exhausted, come home, collapse into bed. So getting him to stop hill walking was another piece of the homework that he ended up kind of doing, to try and break up the patterns that were happening internally. Okay. Surrendering, it's about letting be, staying with, coming to and from, noticing things, being open to one's own vulnerability. What I was asking down there, where's your edge on this now? What are you struggling with? And speaking your truth about that edge. I think it's very difficult for bereaved people. They feel we're asking them to let go of something that's a treasure in their lives. So we really work at, well, can we initially let it be and not add to it? Can we then stay with it? Can we then come to and from the grief? Can we then begin to notice who we are in the grief? Can we become more open to our own vulnerability, the edges that we're struggling around? And then can we support people speaking the truth to other people about that edge? So like with the client I had today now, I was saying to her, one of the things she might do is talk to her husband about the edge that she finds herself on, the edge of disappointment. So rather than walking out of the room, could she begin to say something more grounded about that she was struggling right now with that edge of disappointment, that she can't quite connect, and other people can't quite connect with her, and see if that helped the experience that she's in. So it's about getting more flexible with the experience all the time. Now, the stories, working with bereavement always brings issues up about yourself and your own philosophy of suffering. It always brings up issues about putting your personal story into a broader social or historical context and uniting with others who are suffering a similar experience. So we use the loving kindness meditation and that little meditation I did with you towards about the 6th or 7th group to try and help people find a deeper context for their suffering. Now, the other very important thing that mindfulness teaches you is non-action. We'll put all these slides up and you can pull them down if you want to. But the other piece of it is constantly working with people not to act. Because emotions are states of tension, they effectively push you into action internally within yourself. While you're teaching people to listen as deeply as possible to your feelings that they're experiencing, you're equally trying to get them not to act on the basis of those feelings. So non-action is a radical commitment in mindfulness as well. Listen to your heart, to your emotions, listen to what they're pushing you to do, and non-action builds up a tolerance of affect. So you can tolerate the feelings that are arising and not act on them, but then use the energy of that emotion with an intention towards transformation. So this is where you begin to kind of help people understand that emotions are simply energy states. So very interesting for me working with people who are very angry and who are using their affect, say for example to sue a medical system, very common, right? You get people in intensely angry and my God, they're going to sue the system, and they have a very tight cognitive system around that, about justice and fairness and doing something on behalf of a parent they've lost. So they get locked in cognitively and their anger is churning around inside their body. And getting something like that to try and begin to understand what anger is, that it's a cry for justice, it's an obstacle in their path, but then begin to feel behind the anger what's the layer of energy that's attached to it, and is this how they now want to use their energy? Is that the choice they want to make around using their energy? And my experience is invariably you can get people to pause and go to therapy, provided you're very tolerant of the fact that they then can pick their legal case up afterwards. So I'm often bribing people, kind of saying to them, you know, could we take all that energy and could we plough it into 12 weeks of therapy, and then by all means sue the place afterwards if you want to pick it up the other side. But can that energy be used for something else? And you get interesting twos and fro's on that. One girl I tried to persuade, her boyfriend has dumped her after 9 years and she's got it. And I said to her, well, therapy, I'm not going to therapy, you know? And she said, no, I don't want to go to therapy because I don't want to change. Because if he chooses to come back, I want to be the same person that he left. I thought, oh, that's kind of interesting. And so we had a conversation about then how can she use the affect that she's experiencing now, all her sadness and her distress, how can we use that as in the benefit of her mental health, right? So how can we do something on that track, right? So she did agree that she would think about using that energy to some effect in her own life, rather than trying to hold it and freeze it until he comes back, you know. So it's a useful way to think about it. Yeah. So they're that's the steps you're inviting people through. Intention, teaching them to breathe properly, teaching them to decouple affect from narrative, which is really important. That's really, really important to separate those two things out. And then get them not to act, and then remarkably their tolerance of their affect begins to really, really steady up. So my last little bit then, and we'll have a time to talk. Philosophy of life. A lot of people, we work with an older population. A lot of people would have a very Catholic or Christian background, and which has a very strong mandate on suffering, and a very strong mandate on suffering being redemptive, right? So you will find people who resist working with their own suffering because they have a very particular philosophical position on it. And that's all very well if they have a very strong other side of that philosophy, which tells them that if you suffer, you will gain paradise and you will meet your loved one in paradise. So if they can hold the two poles of it, we've got something going, and often we send them to talk to the chaplain if somebody is very stuck in that position. But I'm seeing now those people caught historically in a halfway house where they've had a very strong education on Catholic suffering but have lost faith in a Catholic heaven. So they're in the worst of worlds at the moment, and they're, you know, very difficult place to be. So we spend time then asking people to think and try and review some of this, or go talk to a chaplain, or do something that can look at the discrepancies in these philosophies, right? We see young people who have no philosophy of anything at all and are on their uppers then when they end up very seriously in a very, very difficult place because they have no philosophical position. And what works terribly well with them is music. I'm very fond of Leonard Cohen, so we play lots of Leonard Cohen. So, because he's rather dark. He was a Zen master for a long time, so he has very interesting lyrics. There's a lovely one about going home without my burden, going home behind the curtain, going home to a place that's better than before. So he's got some very, very nice lyrics that you can work with people. So it's very important to find out a little bit about where are people positioning their suffering in their own minds. This is the Buddhist notion of suffering, which is the great wheel of suffering, the great wheel of life and death. And in the centre we have ignorance, greed, and what's the other one? I did look it up. So that I know it properly. But they see the wheel of suffering in life as being driven by these internal states. Can't remember what they were. Ignorance, greed? Illusion, ignorance, and greed are they see as the core of suffering. So if you have illusions in your mind, if you're too greedy in your attachments, if you're constantly pulling and clinging at things, and ignorance is just ignorance. It's just where you're blocked in your thinking, you're not thinking properly. So they see those as the great drivers, and they see attachment, being overly attached, and aversion as the two engines that drive suffering as well. So it's a very, I mean, it's not something I understand very much, because my mindfulness is John Kabat-Zinn's mindfulness, which is not religious based, and then of course their notion of freedom is into the great mind, that we move into this great space of energy. So it's very different philosophy, and I don't teach it because I don't know it. I'm not a practitioner in that way, but it's a very useful alternative for people to begin to wonder about or think about. But we have to be mindful of our boundaries, right? Like if I'm working as a therapist, I'm working as a therapist. If I'm teaching mindfulness, I teach John Kabat-Zinn's work, and that's what I teach. But both within ourselves and within our clients, it's a useful question to wonder what is their philosophy of suffering. So it's both a useful question because it gives you quite an interesting response from where your clients are positioning themselves in it. And then within ourselves, it is a question we need to wonder about within ourselves. I was working with a lady who has motor neuron, she's got a variant of motor neuron illness. She's only 45, and we had a very stormy session one day because she was talking about the cruelty of her illness, but she was in a bad place, she was very locked into it, and she has done a lot of meditation. And I said to her, you know, can we just sit for a moment? Can we meditate together rather than, because it was going nowhere in the session, a very difficult session. So we sat and spent about 15-20 minutes meditating together, and I said to her, you know, where are you at, where am I at? And I was very congruent with her, because I said to her, you know, we're going to have to find a way of struggling with what you're struggling with at the moment, you know, and have there any thoughts in your mind? And she began to talk about the fact, did I believe she could be enlightened in this life? I'm thinking, oh God, it's a big question, you know. And I said to her, well, so what's coming to your mind? What's arisen while you were meditating? And she said, well, as I meditated, I began to wonder I believe that there's some benefit in that? Do I believe that that's a place to stand in? Can we work on that together? So that was, quite another place to stand in relation to a very serious illness, because of course the position would be that as long as she has a body is a gift, and it's a place in which she can be enlightened. So working with very serious chronic illnesses, I think it is a philosophy that has a lot to give us, albeit that I don't understand it very well. So I don't know if that's something you've any thoughts about, or you'd like to ask me any questions about. Because really, I think myself, the benefit of mindfulness really is that it's going deeper than meaning. I'm not terribly fond of meaning as a construct myself, because again, the chap I started with, Joseph Campbell, believes, he says, I don't believe people are looking for a meaning of life as much as they are looking for an experience of being alive. And you see, mindfulness weighs in very strongly on the experience of being alive. Weighs very strongly on that side, because I wonder if at times there's too fast a struggle for meaning, particularly in bereavement. Nothing drives grief people nuttier than people giving them meaning for their suffering, or saying to them, there must be a meaning in this, or maybe and struggling to find meanings for them. It's a very painful place for them to be. So maybe at times we're inviting people into an experience and into a way of experiencing their loss, much more than in any way trying to take that loss from them or change it in any way. So, I'm open for questions. I've done my bit. You should sit for a minute. If you're working in a mindful context, what you do with people is get them to become aware. You begin to say to people, can we notice what's happening? Now, and also because it happens when they meditate, so you get them to sit, and you get them to breathe, and then you get them to watch what happens. What triggers that cycle where they go into the narrative? So it's very important to watch. Is it a feeling arises? Usually it's a feeling arises. They feel sad, and then their mind automatically goes into, oh my God, this is terrible, my mum is gone, or it's terrible, something has happened. And they cycle on that, and then that brings up other feelings which fuel the feelings, so they're gone on a spin completely. So it's about supporting people, watching that with great curiosity. And initially, they get very puzzled because they think they come to bereavement counselling to tell their story over and over. That's their headspace on it. And so it takes quite a while for them to realise that you are much more interested in them as a person than you are in the story. And if you can shift them in that direction and get them interested in, what is happens now? It's very helpful. Have you done method of levels work? It's very helpful. Watch people in therapy, what happens to them when they shift into that narrative. Just watch their body language, watch the tone of their skin, and begin to talk out loud to them. I notice as you talk about your mum, your shoulders drop. What's happening in your shoulders? It would take time to listen to your shoulders. So begin to watch their body and get into that with them. That begins to break it up. And then they begin to realise you're interested in other things as well.
Often would you come up against the issue of suicide?
It's very common, very, very common to have people have what we consider to be passive suicide ideation. So very, very common to wish you were dead, to wish you were with the other person. And that's like having a cold psychologically. That lingers for a long, long time. Lingers for a long time. And again, it's about noticing when does it arise. So when does that desire arise? but it's also noticing any attachments to it, because fundamentally, existentially, you wouldn't want somebody choosing that state. In other words, you want somebody at 9:30 at night sitting down, feeling that arising and voluntarily going with it. Right? Now, it's not that I think somebody's going to do any harm to themselves, but if you think in terms of their life force and their life energy, where they're choosing, what we were talking about the right thing, where they're choosing to allow their energy to flow, it's not a great idea. So I'd be wanting somebody to be very compassionate towards it, pay attention to that desire, but begin to work with it. Begin to wonder, why now? Why is that arisen now? What's happening in me? What's this feeling? Can I let thought flow by and come back and mind that sad feeling which has arisen within me, or that lonely feeling which has arisen within me, right? But I wouldn't want them to strengthen that trap either, right? And I mean, you do all the usual stuff of a risk assessment and blah, 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 and I've had people moving in bags of pills, and the most common problem we have is where somebody has been a carer for somebody with a very, very serious illness, and 2 years later they're absolutely exhausted, and the desire to die is not so much about missing the person they have loved as a terrible fear that they themselves could die the same way. And that needs care. So you do need to, again, listen very carefully to people, because if it was a fear of dying from a motor neuron disease, I would have that person come and talk to nursing staff or go and talk to their GP. It takes about 2 years after a loss to recover from a physical fear of dying the same way that person died. It's a long time to come out of this side of it.
Do you find that there's a difference between working with people who've been bereaved very suddenly, for example, after an accident, heart attack, or somebody who is suffering bereavement, but the person is dying of heart attack?
Now, that's a very useful question. The answer is, it wouldn't be the primary factor, but it's a very significant secondary factor. The primary factor is the attachment to the person. So you always go back to your well-being. Your well-being is critical in terms of the actual nature of the attachment to the person that is lost. It's really, really critical psychologically, right? Now, apart from that, Mary, the obvious ones are where there's loss of a body, where there's no body to be buried, is a very serious problem, because psychologically we have great difficulty in a situation where you don't literally have a physical body to bury. So loss of the body is very important. Sudden traumatic losses and losses that are socially disenfranchised are the big significant factors we look for. So somebody who has no warning shot is in a much more difficult place than somebody who has been caring for somebody who has cancer diagnosis. Very different place to me. But I always acknowledge those, but then go back to what it was in relationships.
What do you mean by what's socially disenfranchised?
I was thinking about losses where you are not allowed to publicly grieve the person. We still have partners of people. I mean, I have to say, I was on the team at the time where we had a gentleman brought into us in Coma in Vincent's. His lovely family from outside Dublin gathered around his bedside, and he was in Vincent's for 6 to 7 days before he died, right? Afterwards, his male partner, wrote to us to notify us as a team that we had never, ever included him in any of that man's care, because when he came in coma, he was signed in, and his next of kin was signed in as a sister, and none of us asked the question, did he have a partner, and family didn't want to publicly acknowledge his partner. Now, if that was in 2011, we have a full team, nobody asked the question, did this man? Because I think if we had, as a team, asked it, they would have told us. You know, I don't think they were. It wasn't a difficult family. Do you know what I mean? I don't think they would have said, "Oh no," but we never asked, and they weren't willing to step into that space. So you know, that's a very unfortunate, serious situation. It does happen there, and it happens in second relationships a lot. find certain losses get flushed out in the newspapers. Very eminent radio personalities that died, and suddenly you find it's being thrashed out a year later in the newspaper. A little bit, whose grief is most important? Do you know, was it his family, was it his partner? It goes over and back, and you think, why is that in the papers? In the papers because it wasn't a press. You know, there was no social context for that loss to be worked out for the partner.
So would you include in that also perhaps abortions or other kinds of losses that it's just not around gay losses?
Yeah.
And sometimes miscarriage as well. People will tell you that they don't get the same.
Yeah.
Or separation.
Yeah.
That's a huge loss.
Yeah.
They don't get the same.
And I mean, we're having to learn an awful lot about families. Families are no longer the standard family model in our minds, and it's about consistently asking open questions. But it is new territory for us, and sometimes we don't do it terribly well.
You mentioned a 15-year-old that died, and how do you manage that?
Well, I mean, it's a very tricky problem because at the time it was a major connection in her life. It was terribly, terribly important to her. We asked her mum to supervise the page so that not too much graphic detail went out on the page, and I mean graphic detail, literally physical detail about her illness. It was a very open house, which was great. Because people came in and out of it all the time, which was good as well. It wasn't ideal, and we had great limits in terms of what we could do. You see, because we had confidentiality limits around it as well. So the best we could do was advise the parent and ask the parents involved to notify the school, and the school then did some very nice work around trying to manage it. But I mean, we were on a massive learning curve around. We had no idea what the implications of processing a loss on Facebook was actually going to be.
And it was help her?
But it certainly was extremely helpful for her, because over the last 3 months of her life, it meant that her connection to the outside world and our peers was very alive and active and being very involved with her over that period of time. My main concern was their age, to be honest with you. 50 is a bit young to be exposed to it's bad age psychologically to lose a peer. But it's a whole new territory, and I'm an expert on it, I didn't think it was one where I'd be advising don't do it. That's what I thought. Shutting it down because I wasn't really sure what was going to happen. Now, have I talked enough about mindfulness though? One of my guilty thoughts as I was talking to you earlier on was, because you're fairly familiar with mindfulness, are you coming away with a clearer sense how I might put the two things together? No? Okay.
Because you said many times, and when you say, well, I am a therapist, and I say I do mindfulness, and it seems to be two separate things. So
Yeah. Okay.
The boundary.
No, I understand that. So I'm careful about what I'm contracting for with a client. So I'm careful about that. When we run our mindfulness groups, which we do for brief people who are 9 months on, we use all the mindfulness, right? And the only thing we have a more careful eye is on the bereavement side, on how we manage the bereavement side of it, right? So we would use all the things I've been talking to you about being careful about how they manage their emotions, how they engage with the narrative. We would use that. I don't know if you're familiar with the Green Book, the NBCT book, the mindfulness-based cognitive therapy book. Are you familiar with John Hapton's book?
Yes.
The Blue Book. Okay, there's the Blue Book and the Green Book, right? You know that. 2 Bibles. You need to buy the Green Book.
Okay.
Okay, which breaks down every session. And then what we do on the bereavement side is where the cognitive therapy pieces come in. That's where we give people homework, get people to keep brief journals, get people to work more deeply on their feelings. Next questions?
I'm asking as well as on the nerve piece, I'm not really sure what I'm asking. I work with relationship with pastoral population, and
few experts in the room that we might refer that to. Do you have anything come up in England around that? Stroke population? I mean, I'd certainly monitor it very carefully. One of my thoughts would be, that she just needs to do loads of careful feedback and try and get somebody objective to do the feedback. Like, so if she's delivering it herself, it'd be very helpful to somebody else come in and try and get some feedback. I think personally now, I think it's a quite difficult thing to do, and I'd be curious about the results. To be honest with you, I'd be very curious because I mean the only population that comes to my mind to compare them to, and it's a totally different population, but it's because of their capacity, is drug addicts. And Tony did a group a year or two ago with a drug addict population, and only 1 out of 15 completed the course, and he had very mixed results from it, very, very mixed results. So only 1 person out of 15 really, you could honestly stand up and say, did substantially well out of it. There was about half of them that got something out of it, but the other half couldn't stabilise themselves enough to use the method, basically. Now, I know it's a totally different population, but again, it's a very vulnerable population. So I'd be cautious.
That was my reaction.
Cautious, yeah. I'm a little cautious because it tends to get sprinkled on everything at the moment. So you have to wonder a little bit about
the understanding that I think the idea is to adapt the materials and then pilot it. And as part of
Interesting.
research study.
well, at least maybe they're going to pilot it properly, yeah. Because see, the other critical factor is your own capacity to sit in the space, and I think that's something that people need to make an ethical decision about. How steady is your mindfulness practice in order to move into a group. And in terms of the teaching, we've all been through different teaching programs, but the requirement really is that you run 2 groups. You do the 8-week course, either Bangor or Massachusetts, wherever you do it. You then run 2 groups, which are preferably your friends and neighbours, or a group that, maybe a group of colleagues, and then you go back and do teacher training 1, which is what I've done with. Then you come back and start co-facilitating, then you run a patient group, and then you do teacher training 2. So it's kind of a pyramid structure. So there's really quite a requirement that people are 2 years into practicing themselves before you start using it as a clinical method. So that's the other caution.
Okay, Mrs. Bates, it's 7 o'clock. You've had a long day, and we have taken. I think we could keep you here all night. So on behalf of the group, I'd like to say a very big thank you to you. Thank you. I don't know about you, but I think mindfulness coupled with grief work, seen through a psychological lens, are probably some of my favourite things. So I think there's enthusiasm in the room, and thank you. I think what you shared and dovetailed together was lovely, and I can hear the energy and the enthusiasm for that. Thank you. Lovely. Could we make it? Right.